Well, I would say welcome everyone, but everyone seems like a bit of an overstatement. So I'll welcome you each individually by name. Shouldn't take more than a minute or so. All right, well, thank you for making the rather long trek to this end of the conference center. That took me about 7 or 8 minutes to walk here from the main hall, so I appreciate you making the effort. Optimistically, we'll get some more people come in as the session starts. But my name is Dean Wells, and this is
Alan Marshall, Hyper-V.
Alan and I are going to be talking to you about what we like to refer to as 4, 5, or 6 different names. There's protecting the platform, Harden the fabric, VM shielding, guarded fabric. All in all, it's a means by which you can deploy virtual machines, either as a tenant in a hosted fabric or in a private fabric of your own on-premises, whereby that virtual machine is protected, isolated from the fabric administrator, i.e. somebody could log on to the Hyper-V instance as an administrator, and the only thing they can do to that VM is power it on or power it off. They can't inspect the disk, they can't affect the processes, they can't attach debuggers to the system, they can't change the configuration, and in some cases they can't even power it on if they have attached a debugger to the system. So basically we were trying to build very, very strong assurances, very strong barriers between the admin of the box and the VMs that are running on it. And there are a large number of use cases even outside of the obvious tenant and hoster scenario. So, without further ado, the way that we're going to do this is Alan and I are going to split it in two. Ideally, we'd have had 2 sessions, but we don't have that luxury. So I'm going to talk to you about the end-to-end scenarios and where this thing fits and some of the technology that underlies it. And then I'm going to hand over to Alan about the halfway segment after a demo. And Alan's going to walk you all the way through some of the very, very cool underpinnings that exist in Hyper-V, the hypervisor, and in Windows that make all of this a reality. That's the plan, at least. So, the agenda. The first thing. Perhaps it's obvious, but why does this all matter? I'll give you a little bit of context, just to make sure you know why we've done this. Next, we're going to talk about protecting tenant secrets with shielded VMs. So this is really explaining what is it a shielded VM does, and we'll explain it in the form of, if you're a hoster, you'll get this from it. If you're a tenant, you'll get this from it, etc. Then we'll move on to the assurances that shielding provides. Assurances is a term that is now very commonplace in our language, but it's a term that we're using as a big umbrella in Microsoft to describe a new way of thinking about security where you get certain assurances from this new mode of thinking. So you'll understand what the assurances are when I define them, so probably best left to the definitions there. Then we'll move on to how do you build a guarded fabric. So if any of you are a hoster, quick show of hands. Anyone a hoster? Excellent. Good. And the rest of you are therefore in the non-hosting enterprise or public sector space. It's valuable to both. So we'll tell you how to build it. What do you need to change in the existing data centers to adopt the necessary infrastructure to deploy shielded VMs? And last but not least, which is the entirety of Alan's session, the what makes it all tick. So who's a geek? You need to stay for Alan's piece. It's kind of cool stuff.
That's the good stuff.
It is some good stuff. All right, so perhaps it's obvious, but why does all this matter? Trade secrets theft. You can read that. I'm not good at reading slides. In fact, I don't like reading slides. But look at the amount of money we're talking about here. That was 2 years back. It's probably a lot larger than that right now. And it's all related to IT-based theft, computing theft. Security concerns then become the blocker in the adoption of public services, the cloud. People are worried that if they adopt the cloud, they become less secure, not more secure. I'm not sure I buy the less secure statement, but that turns out to be a contentious topic, so I'm not going to raise that one right now. And insider attacks are prominent among those concerns. We did a survey recently, and we offered people a lot of different questions, and basically we said to them, if you can answer these questions, then we'll give you a little prize at the end. And they answered the questions, and it was all about security. And then we said, well, the prize is $50, and all you need to do is provide us with your social security number. And without fail, everyone gave their social security number over. So apparently, security is only worth $50. So it doesn't take a great deal of bribery to get people to perform insider attacks on your behalf. Now, the central risk here is the admin privileges. We gave out these admin privileges, right? When did we give them out? How many of you have attended sessions where we tell you how long ago we gave these out? It was somewhere around 50 years ago. That's what we're thinking if you go as far back as when admins existed. We gave out all of these privileged accounts, and we gave them out 50 years ago, and now we're struggling to take it back. Well, that's what we're starting on. We're starting down that road, trying to take back the notion of admin privilege. Because admin privilege cannot mean the global keys to the kingdom. It needs to mean admin in an isolated state. Some level of administrative boundary around it. Today it means far too much. Take an Active Directory domain admin. What does that mean you're an admin of? Everything. I have a little bit of experience in that space. It means you are an admin of everything. That's not the way it can continue to work. So the conclusion to all of this is that we need to change the way we think about security. So what we're doing now is, in addition to protecting the edge of the network, good, strong defenses at the edge, we're now assuming breach. That doesn't mean that we're being pessimistic, that we've just given up us through the edge, let's not defend that anymore. We're saying, in addition to defending that, let's defend by working on the assumption that somebody did manage to penetrate the edge. Let's start defending it from the innards. Stop lateral movement, and you've seen us doing lateral movement prevention. There's a lot of stuff going on. This is just one piece of that overall pie. So, if you take a look at this little comparison here, who has access to your machines? If we compare physical machinery to virtual machinery, you can see in the case of physical machinery, I've got perimeter walls and gates and stupid little barriers with security guards that go up and down. But then I've got data centers and locked cages and racks. These are difficult things to get to, so there's a limited number of people who can get to them as an admin. Now, if you contrast that to a virtual machine, it's not such a happy picture. A server admin can, of course, get to a virtual machine, so can the storage admin, because he'll walk off with his disk array or just copy it so no one knows. The network admin can probably do exactly the same by sucking it off the wire because they've got credentials and permissions. Backup operators, of course they can. So it's a very, very different story with virtual machinery because we don't gain the protections from the physical nature of the hardware. So, what is a shielded VM then, and how does it address that? Well, if you take a look at this statement that Alan and I labored over for minutes, this is what we came up with. It's quite a good statement, actually, because this is a difficult thing to describe. Basically, we're providing you a virtual machine that is protected from data center admins via a variety of very clever and modern technologies, some of which have been around for a while, crypto, and then some new stuff, which Alan will talk about soon. We believe the value in this is going to be apparent to you guys. Either it already is apparent as a hoster, or it will start to become apparent over the coming months and years. The people that we've spoken to on the booth are already saying that they get it. We've had a lot of interest in this. So take a look at this. This should hopefully reinforce it a bit. So as a hoster, I can protect my tenant VMs and their data from data center administrators. That's a fantastic thing. It's something you can charge more for as a hoster. Charge for a regular VM, add a 20% surcharge for a shielded VM, or whatever you consider to be reasonable. As a tenant, I can finally run workloads in the cloud, but I can finally meet compliance and regulatory requirements. This may well unblock things from a tenant standpoint by being able to reduce the size of your on-prem data centers, reduce the management burden, and that's also obviously the same value for the hoster. And then as an enterprise, strong separation of duties. So many people do not virtualize Active Directory domain controllers because they feel that it gives too much control to the Hyper-V admins. The Hyper-V admins are supposed to be subject to AD, not vice versa. And when AD runs as a virtual machine, technically it's subject to the Hyper-V admin's whim. They could copy the Active Directory database off, run off with it on a USB stick, and then spend the next 3 months trying to drag the hashes out of it and turn them into passwords. Nobody would be any the wiser. That's what they mean by they're subject to the Hyper-V admins. It's not a good position to be in. So if we take a look at shielding, step by step then, what I'm going to do here is first show you again how things look today. So take a look at those nasty little red cells there. And if we then go and turn that Hyper-V host into a guarded host and watch my nifty little shielding icon appear, oof, and now the VMs will skulk steadily behind the Hyper-V hardware, and that's it, they're gone. But look at the status change in the cells. We're now saying that the top one, okay, there is a configuration dependency here, and I'll explain what that config dependency is very, very shortly. But for the rest of the scenarios, no, these admins don't really have access to it in the same way. Sure, they might be able to copy it off, but it's encrypted. What are you going to do with it? If you're saying BitLocker is weak, then okay, go prove that BitLocker is weak. But the industry as a whole does not think BitLocker is weak, and neither do Microsoft. Protecting the key, that's the important part with BitLocker, with any crypto. You've got to protect the key. Well, that's where some of our investments lie. So moving on then, if you take a look at how this is done then, we have a component on the right-hand side of that called the Host Guardian service. The keys aren't really stored there. I've drawn it this way because it makes it easy to understand. So let's go with that's the way it works for the second, and we'll add more details a little bit later. So the Host Guardian service is a means by which a shielded VM gets unlocked. The implication there is that Hyper-V cannot unlock a VM that is shielded by itself. It has to go and ask nicely. So we've used a little British line there, please sir, can I have some more? Because that goes well with my accent. For those of you who don't understand that, you should read more. So, please, sir, can I have some keys? And it goes and asks the Host Guardian service, give me the keys to decrypt the flashing VM. And the Host Guardian service will say to it, I will give you those keys only if I know who you are and I believe that you are non-compromised. We do that through some very, very rigorous measurements of the boot and through code integrity policies, which you scrape off of a known good system when you build it. We then give that known good state to the host guardian, and when Hyper-V wants to power a machine on, it has to prove it is still in that known good state. If that's the case, the host guardian service will then happily say, all right, 1, I recognize you, and 2, I trust that you are integral still. You still match the way I measured you when you were known good. So it then sends back the key that suits that particular VM, which I apparently over-animated. Or did it do it? You know what? I don't care. The animation sent the key back. Let's move on then. Did the animation go? Apparently I do care.
Absolutely.
Okay. All right, a few commonplace questions and answers then. Hey, look, we don't spend all this time on animations just to have them break. Here are some of the things that people typically ask at this point. Question 1, can Microsoft Azure provide similar protections? Yes, it can. It was announced yesterday. They are not calling it shielding. Azure is built on Generation 1 virtual machinery, so they have less luxuries to build this on top of. But they do have a good solution that provides data at rest encryption, and that was delivered yesterday in the session that you can see there. Question 2, are you able to protect Linux VMs? That is our goal. We are quite literally working on that as I speak to do Generation 2 protections for Linux VMs, probably based on dencrypt for those of you that are familiar with Linux. We don't know for sure yet how the design is going to land, but we're working on it as I speak. What Windows OS versions can be shielded? Okay, well, Windows Server 2012 and later, they're all fully supported. Windows Server 2008 and R2 are part of our goal because we know they're still prominent operating systems out there today, if not the most prominent. However, they don't quite work with the technique that we're using right now. There's an issue with the generation of the VM that those OSs suffer from. Subsequently, we're working to light that up now. So not a strong commitment, but definitely a strong goal, and that's what we're working toward for the release of Windows Server 2016. So, demos then, the proof of the pudding. So, what I shall do at this point is show you 3 separate demos. The first thing I'm going to do is show you the way the situation is today. So, take the candidate that I mentioned earlier on as a virtual machine.
You've got to switch.
Thank you for reminding me. There you go. Can you see it now? What I'm going to do then is I'm going to take an Active Directory domain controller as a candidate virtual machine. Imagine this was deployed on Windows Server 2012 or 2012 R2. We're not saying that that was a bad product, because Alan would literally smack me from there. What we're saying is we deployed that product conscious that Hyper-V admins or Fabric admins were a trusted entity. That was part and parcel of our design principle. Well, that's what's changing today, but it hasn't changed, obviously, in the past. So this is an example of what could be done in the past on that principle, the fact that admins were trusted. So if I can find the mouse. The way I'm going to do this is I'm going to pretend to be a malicious admin, and I'm going to go and find a VHDX of a domain controller. And I'm going to open it in the disk manager of the Hyper-V host. When I say OK, it will appear here. The desktop background will magically change in time with that by pure coincidence. It's not related. And you can see that the disk is labeled DIT and secrets. DIT is the directory information table or tree, the Active Directory database, and it's got some arbitrary secrets on it. If I look here, sure enough, oh no, I can't open the Active Directory database folder. Why not? Well, that's because it's been ACLed, or the authorization says it's system only. Oh, well, that's going to stop me, isn't it? I'll simply come here, I'll go add, I'll say locations, cancel that, choose the laptop, and I'm just going to add the administrators, if I could type, from the laptop, and I can't type. Give it full control, OK, OK. And now I have access to the Active Directory database. So although there may appear to be soft blocks in place, I'm the admin of this system. ACLs are mine to fudge with, because I'm the admin of this box, and as far as this box is concerned, this disk is on this box. So I'm allowed to change the ACL. I could therefore attack the Active Directory DIT. The end result would be a password dump, and if I look inside the password.txt, you can see that this is my attempt at starting to dump users' accounts by scavenging through the columns of that database, sucking out passwords, and then brute forcing various random password combinations until the plain text turns into a hash that aligns with what's in the DIT. This is a reality today. This is not difficult to do. So this is the reason why many companies are unhappy running Active Directory domain controllers on Hyper-V instances, because it reverses the notion of who has the seniority in terms of the authority. Say again? Yeah, it's certainly not contained to Hyper-V. This is certainly something that is true of VMware as well. Thank you, Guido, for pointing that out. Guido is an identity and directory MVP, or has been for many years, so he's technically defending his baby at this point. All right, let's go on to the second part of the demo then. Let's show you how it is going forward. Oops, I've actually already got this loaded. I did the cookery show approach. Or at least I did have. There you go. Let's go in to the Azure Pack console and show you how it is I create a shielded VM. Now, I mentioned earlier that a lot of these technologies are very, very complicated. They've taken us years to engineer. Now, that complexity sometimes translates into the user experience. So I want to show you that here. It takes a little bit of learning, so please pay close attention to how it is you create a shielded VM. This is pretty complex. So I go New, Standalone Virtual Machine, and then I choose it from the gallery. This is not that new so far. I'll filter the list down and go into Templates. And then you can see that the icons, there's a differentiator in the icons. One has a shield. Genius. So that's obviously the one that is a shielded template. A shielded template has some special characteristics that I'd love to talk to you about one-on-one afterwards if you'd like us to tear that apart a little bit, but we don't have the time now if I want to get Alan's piece in there. So just assume that it's very subtly different from a regular template, but for all intents and purposes, it does the same thing. It just creates shielded VMs. When I go next, I give it a name, and I'll call it ADDC2. And now, because the IT department owns it, I will select the shielding data from the IT department because they own domain controllers. But that, of course, begs the question, what the heck is this shielding data stuff? Shielding data is a way in which we package all of the secrets that you normally give through a web form, like the username for the administrator, the user password for the administrator, RDP certificates to secure communication, all those things. Well, if you provided those in a web form to the hoster, either over SSL or plain text, then you've given the very thing to the hoster that you're trying to prevent them from having, access to the machine. So we have to be able to deliver that to the VM in a way whereby the hoster can't get to it. So this is an encrypted package of all the secrets that the guest VM needs in order to deploy itself. It even includes a catalog of all the disks with signatures on those disk images that are permitted to create this shielded VM, just in case the malicious admin in the hoster added malware after we'd uploaded this signed disk. Well, if they add malware to the disk after the fact, we can test it because the signature doesn't match anymore. So they can't even attack the disk image. Does that make sense? Okay. So what we do at this point is we click on Next, we connect it to our network, and say yes. And now you can see down the bottom, in the typical Azure Pack manner, it's creating that VM. Now, that's all well and good, and we'll let it bake on that for a little bit. You can also see that I've got an LBI file server here. This is the human resources file server. They've decided, even though it's low business impact, they want it shielded. This is the more likely scenario during initial adoption of shielded VMs, especially in a hoster scenario, i.e., you're not creating a new one, you want to convert one that's already running there to shielded. Obviously, that would be cool if we could do that. So what I do is I click on it, go to the Configure tab, click on Shield, specify the correct shielding data, and different shielding data could have different passwords. Different shielding data would have different disk catalogs. Different shielding data would have different RDP certificates and anything else that's embedded within there. The amount of stuff we take out of shielding data when converting a VM is very, very small. When building a new VM, we take all of it, but it's very, very small here. Either way around, we still have to specify which department it's for, or which shielding data it is, and that obviously correlates back to the department. They are both now happily being created. So what I want to do at this point is I want to bring up the Hyper-V management console, and when that one starts up, I want to show you something. Here is our demo domain controller that's underlying this entire demo. Do you notice the thumbnail down the bottom left? It can generate a thumbnail view because it's allowed to see the video output of the VM. And I can even double-click on the thumbnail view, and I can bring up a console connection, which means I'm now redirecting the keyboard and the mouse and the video all to the Hyper-V host. Does that seem like a good idea for a shielded VM who we're trying to protect from the host? You could literally be logging on using your own console access to the machine and then have the Hyper-V host admin steal it from you, and you've just provided them an unlocked guest because you logged on for them. We can't allow any of this. So these all get disabled in different scenarios for shielded VMs. So if I click here, notice how no thumbnail. If I double-click here, You cannot connect to a shielded VM via the console. We consider this a security benefit. Some people consider it a tax, aka pain in the ass. I prefer to go with the former, the security benefit. It is necessary. Now, Alan will also talk about ways in which you can have your cake and eat it, where you get some of the security value without the tax, and he'll talk about that a little bit later. So last but not least, as part of this demo, I want to show you what happens when I attempt the same attack on the domain controller that's shielded by going back into that disk management console. And at this point, I'm going to go attach a VHD. And here's my ADDC with the shielded disk. If I go ahead and click on Open, and then I say OK, sure enough, look at that, it mounted it. So what was it all for? Well, it does say it's BitLocker encrypted, but it still looks the same, so let me go ahead and open it. It says it's not accessible. Well, I'm not going to give up yet. Let's try a different way of doing this. Let's go from this PC, and then I'll look at it here. Oh, it's got a padlock on it. I'll try opening it there, and it says there are no supported protectors. It's saying it can't find the key protector to decrypt the full volume encryption key, which is needed to decrypt the BitLocker disk. So we're still broken, but I've got one attack vector left. The universal attack vector, the command prompt that bypasses all security. So I'll go to drive oh, no, that doesn't work either. There is no way of getting at this. These are not soft blocks. This is not pretend security. That disk is a meaningless lump of useless bits to the Hyper-V admin, which was the goal. So what we've done there is we've shown you that for a regular VM, back on the slightly older versions of Hyper-V or VMware, where we trusted the Hyper-V admin, you could gain full access to that database, suck off the Active Directory DIT, run some brute force digest tools, which I happen to know how to run, and suck out passwords and happily build a password.txt file until such time as you can log on to AD as the admin. That's a nice little EOP path from Hyper-V admin to domain admin, and keys to the kingdom are yours. Try the same with a shielded VM. I don't even know how to do it. I can't bypass this. Very, very cool stuff. So now let me bring back up the slides so that we can proceed wildly on. So, what do you think? Was that a cool capability to be able to do that? You see, that's what happens in England at the end of cool capabilities. We give rounds of applause. Honestly, bloody Americans, no manners. Right, so what assurances does shielding provide? Are there any Americans in here, or have I just upset the whole room? Yes, pretty much. I thought so. Okay. So, shielded VM security assurances. Encryption and data at rest and in-flight protection. What we're referring to here is the disk is encrypted at rest and when being copied over the wire. And if you live migrate the VM, we do that in plain text. No, of course we don't. We encrypt that stream too. So live migration has no impact on the assurances that you get from this. Admin lockout. Host admins can't gain access to the VM secrets. In fact, they can't gain access to the VM anything. They can't even reconfigure it. The furthest they could go is denial of service, because they can power it off. Well, they could do that anyway by pulling the power cable out, so we made no effort to solve that one. It's not worth it because it doesn't gain enough ground. They'll rip the power cable out if they want to, or crash the server. They can do many things to denial of service attack it. And then we've got this attestation of health. I mentioned that earlier on. You can't even power the VM on or live migrate it until such time as the Hyper-V host that's trying to do that, i.e. power it on, or it's the recipient of the VM in the live migration case, attests to the host guardian service that it's healthy. It has to be deemed healthy. So what about the deployment options? We have two mutually exclusive modes of deployment here. We call them the attestation mode. The first attestation mode is hardware trusted attestation. That's the one I articulated earlier on. TPM based, everything is rooted in the hardware. Very cool stuff, extremely difficult to break, if breakable at all. We're working on that right now and we're pen testing it ourselves. And then we've got a secondary one called admin trusted. We believe this is the most likely candidate for enterprises to dip their toe in the water of VM shielding, so to speak. It's a very, very easy one to adopt. The only thing you do here is add a Hyper-V instance to a group and then tell the host guardian service what that group is. Now when the Hyper-V instance tries to power a shielded VM on, it simply goes over to the host guardian and says, "Can I have a key?" and presents a Kerberos ticket. Host guardian cracks open the Kerberos ticket, looks inside it and says, "Are you a member of that group?" And if you are, it says, "Sure, it can have the key." What's the big difference here? The hardware-rooted attestation mode measured the boot path and had a kernel mode code integrity policy that has to match at all times or it does not release keys. That means there's no way you can run malware on the box. You can't run special binaries to try and circumvent all these protections. In the admin trusted, You get data protection at rest, and you get live migration, encryption, and all those good things, but you can't trust the Hyper-V bits to the same extent as you can with TPM-based, because they could have been compromised by somebody that managed to do so. Does that make sense, the delta between those two? Okay?
Yeah, but why would you use one versus the other?
One is much, much easier to adopt admin mode. It doesn't require that you change the hardware in the data center, which Alan will talk about later. There's TPM v2 requirements for the newer stuff. So it's a lot harder to adopt the TPM base, but I'll discuss that in a second. If you take a look at the attestation workflow here then for hardware trusted, you start a shielded VM. The client initiates the attestation protocol. It goes and talks to the host guardian service. It sends over its boot and code integrity measurements. The host guardian service validates those against the known good ones, and assume that that's an affirmative match. It sends back the necessary keying material for it to decrypt that VTPM and get the full volume encryption key decrypted and boot up the BitLocked or shielded VM. If you look at it in the admin trusted, it's simply a matter of starting it, presenting it a Kerberos ticket, having the Kerberos ticket cracked, validate that the group SID that's present in that ticket is the one that is supposed to authorize it to be given key material, and if it is, we'll send back the key. Very much simpler. The setup of this one requires literally only one Windows Server 2016 host to be a Hyper-V guarded host, and one Windows Server 2016 host to be the host guardian service. You wouldn't ideally want to leave it in that mode because that's not what you call highly available, but that would be your minimum bar to adopt. The minimum bar to adopt it with hardware-based attestation is you've got to change the underlying hardware, and I say this with absolute certainty, of your Hyper-V hosts. The reason I can say it with certainty is because they require a TPM v2 plus UEFI 2.3.1 Rev C. Well, that's okay. The revision of the UEFI firmware is not really a pain, it's the TPM. Even we can't get this hardware reliably working because the vendors are still producing it. So I know you don't have it. And if you do, you work for Dell, or HP, or Lenovo, or Intel, or any of the others. And please give us the boxes you're working on because ours aren't working well. So I know you can't do this yet. For those of you that can get your hands on that hardware, give the TPM-based attestation a go. It's an impressive thing to watch it work. Very, very secure indeed. So configuring the attestation. You have an attestation mode we mentioned. You have to build an authorized host list, i.e. the authorized host list in admin mode is whoever's a member of the group. The authorized host list in TPM-based attestation is registration of the public key, the endorsement key, something we refer to as the EKPub, from the TPM v2 of the Hyper-V host that you're saying, okay, that guy should be allowed to run shielded VMs. I bless it as a guarded host. And then we've got the key release criteria, and I just explained how the key release criteria works between AD mode or admin mode and TPM mode. How do you build a guarded fabric? Well, here's how it looks. Min requirements I already outlined, and obviously this deck will be available to you after the fact, so you can take a look at this minimum set here. And you can see what I'm pointing out here by the color coordination. We're basically saying you have to add the host guardian service. This is a Windows Server role that comes with Windows Server 2016. You literally install it through the Server Manager add roles, and you're done. The host guardian has a number of cool underlying components. It's an Active Directory forest in its own right. We did this deliberately. It has to be a secure enclave. We call it a safe harbor Active Directory. If you simply domain joined the host guardian service to your existing fabric or corporate AD, it is now subject to, all the poison that lives therein. 15 years of poison, bad ACLs, terrible group policies, logon scripts, all of those things would happen to the host guardian. This thing is the keys to the kingdom. The keys to all of the keys to the kingdom. It has to be very well protected. So we don't recommend that it be joined to an existing corporate AD, and then that recommendation turned into a design choice. It can't be because it's a forest of its own. And obviously you can see down here that we, as an optional component, can have System Center VMM in there as well. So SCVMM is fully enlightened to this, as is the Azure Pack, which is what you saw me use in the user experience that I just demonstrated. So you already know about this. It's very low friction to adopt. Slightly weaker levels of assurance, or substantially, depending on your perspective, but very, very simple to dip your toe in the water and give it a test. And then admin trusted mode, we believe this is the likely thing that enterprises will try first. I don't believe it's where they'll rest. I don't believe an enterprise should stay on this. You don't get enough value from it. However, maybe some of you see that differently. Now, some will certainly require higher levels of assurance. Hosters would be one, the public sector would be another. In this case, you can see that we've brought a number of other components into the mix. We had to change the hardware in the data center on which Hyper-V runs. You don't have to change the hardware on which the host guardian service runs, but that's a small drop in the ocean compared to the number of machines that are actually running your compute fabric. And then if we look at the top, you can see that we added the host guardian service, and now we introduced a hardware security module, because ideally the certificates that are used to secure all of this stuff, the public and private key pairs, they should really be HSM backed. Otherwise you leave a vulnerability in the Windows search store. Sure, you can BitLocker that and you can keep incrementally adding protections to it, but ideally you would have it HSM backed. So if I walked you through the host guardian service, there are a number of components involved in this piece. It has an attestation piece and a key protection piece. There's a host guardian service client, and there are PowerShell modules to administer it all, and it offers high availability both through Active Directory, DNS round-robin-based load balancing, and ClusterDB. So it's actually a cluster as well. All of those components are managed for you. You don't install them discreetly. We install the whole thing, and it builds itself up, rather like an appliance does. Right, Amitabh? Who happens to be the owner of that component. So he just signed up for it being a very appliance-like experience. Please hold him to that. If you take a look at the security for HGS, we recommend that the host guardian has physical security and uses a very limited set of trusted admins. Remember, it's an AD in its own right. It doesn't have to be the domain admin from your corporate or fabric AD. It can be an entirely separate one. Just enough, or GIA administration. How many of you saw the GIA presentations? Okay, I would recommend for those of you that don't, this is a radical new approach to security. Go read up on it and get the slide decks down. GIA is a very, very clever way of constraining things, and it uses an authorization capability that even extends the native authorization capability of whatever it's protecting. For example, AD. GIA on top of AD makes AD do things AD can't natively do. Very, very cool stuff. We don't have the time for it here, but I would recommend you take a look. It's obviously a private AD, we mentioned that already, and it's got HTTPS-based REST API interfaces and various other ways of orchestrating it. The prerequisites, we recommend you have a TPM for this, but it doesn't have to be TPM v2. TPM 1.2 is just fine for this, because we're saying BitLocker the volume. Secure boot is strongly recommended so that HGS itself can't be maliciously attacked by the injection of malware binaries or other binaries that would otherwise compromise the box. The firewall must be enabled. It needs Server 2016 to be a host guardian service role, at least one static IP address, all the sort of typical things you would expect for something that is pivotal to the overall fabric infrastructure as this guy is. Come on. And the underlying platform technologies, what makes all this tick? Well, I'm going to hand it over to Alan at this point, and Alan is going to tell you what makes all this tick.
Perfect. So here's where it gets really interesting, or really boring. So, virtualization-based security is the bedrock on which all of our enterprise assurance and protect the platform offerings in the latest releases, Server 2016, all of those are built on virtualization-based security. What that means is we're leveraging virtualization extensions in the platform, in the processor, to build some enhanced security guarantees. The key takeaway from that is the hypervisors in control of enforcing these new security boundaries. And we'll come back to why that's important in a second here. So when we think about Hyper-V, virtualization-based security is something equally applicable to both the host management partition and to guest virtual machines. And it is also part and parcel of protecting enterprise clients. There's a talk Friday that Scott here is giving on Device Guard, and virtualization-based security, again, is sort of the underpinnings of offering the ability to run enterprise clients in a very strong security posture. So why is virtualization important here? What makes the difference? Well, the hypervisor is far, far orders of magnitude smaller than the host OS. So much more constrained API surface, much smaller footprint. Most notably, the hypervisor runs at a higher privilege level. If you are familiar with the Intel architecture and you're kernel in user mode, CPL0, et cetera, the hypervisor is the highest privilege level piece of software in the system software stack. We refer to it as ring -1. The hypervisor starts before the OS. In fact, since Server 2012, the hypervisor actually boots The whole system boots on the Bootstrap processor with the hypervisor first. We do all the initialization, bring up, apply microcode, all that fun stuff. And by the time your Windows management partition starts, it's already running on a virtualized processor. So we get there first, we get there early, we take control of key system resources. Those are the key points here. Hypervisor binaries, of course, can be folded into measurements for secure and measured boot. So you have a high level of confidence and a way to prove that you're booting and running what you think you should be, that nothing's been tampered with or altered. So you can attest to the integrity of these key pieces of system software that are running in all these scenarios, including the client scenario. Another key system resource here is IOMMUs. Are people familiar with what that means? DMA remapping units and interrupt remapping. They provide, this is the piece of hardware in the platform that allows for device assignment. If you're familiar with SRIOV networking from Windows Server 2012, it leverages the system IOMMUs to make that happen. And these are pretty ubiquitous in platforms today and coming more broadly. So the hypervisor, again, because it launches early, it can take control of this very key system resource and use that to enforce some protection boundaries. In Microsoft's implementation, we don't allow third-party drivers or any installable code in our hypervisor. That's, a very fundamental design decision that was made from day one. So we don't expose ourselves to third-party code or, code that we don't trust running in this layer, or code that could be more easily compromised. And the hypervisor is something that we can use to do a better job with code integrity for the OS, and as it turns out, for guest VMs as well. So we'll touch on that in more detail later. So you can see that the hypervisor is a great place to try to build these secure boundaries because it's just much smaller all the way around, more powerful. We can attest to its integrity, et cetera. Now, what we can't protect with virtualization-based security is certainly hardware-based attacks. Physical presence attacks where you own the machine, you can take it away, crack the lid. We talk about this as the Radio Shack attack, right? If I have unlimited time and no scrutiny from somebody who would care, and I can hang probes or buses or analyzers off it or put special DIMMs in, virtualization-based security can't protect against that. So the hardware-based or physical presence attacks are out of scope for this protection, as is, as Dean mentioned, DOS attacks, which aren't terribly interesting from a security perspective. So again, just looking quickly at what it takes and why we require this hardware to stand up the full depth of the solution we're talking about here. As Dean pointed out, we require UEFI firmware. That gets us secure and measured boot, among other things. And the ability to lock essential security configurations to a UEFI secure variable where they're not easily defeated. TPM 2.0 we've touched on. That's what we use for measuring, for extending measurements into, for storing root certs, et cetera. Clearly, for virtualization-based security, we need virtualization extensions in the platform. What's interesting here and notable on this slide is second-level address translation, which is a term kind of coined inside Microsoft to refer to what Intel calls extended page tables, or hardware page table support for improving the performance of virtualization scenarios. This is the key part here that allows the hypervisor to enforce memory protections that kind of make all of this work. When we leverage the extended page tables in a unique and novel way with our hypervisor, we get the underpinnings that build all of these scenarios on top of them. And one thing to point out here is we require SLAT now, second level address translation, for even Windows Server SKUs. When we came to market with Windows 8 and launched or made Hyper-V available on client platforms, we had to require SLAT to ensure that virtualization performance was even minimally acceptable in the presence of the usual accelerated graphics drivers you have on a client class machine. We didn't need to make that mandate for servers, so we would still support server chips that did not have these extended page tables. And the hypervisor would manage software shadow page tables. server machines don't have accelerated graphics drivers in them, so we didn't run into those kinds of problems. Now with Windows Server 2016, we're requiring SLAT even for server SKUs. Should not be a problem. I think most processors from everybody that we support, every vendor in the market, have had extended page tables for 8 years now, 9 years. So I don't think this is too onerous. And the last thing to note here is we require an IOMU. Again, for the full suite of protections, the hypervisor can use this to provide protection against DMA attacks. So when we talk about what we're building and why, it's useful to kind of start from where we are today. So let's take a quick look at Server 2012 and 2012 R2 and kind of what the landscape for security boundaries in the platform looks like. So you can see we've got hardware, we boot the hypervisor on top of that, and we create our host OS partition. And you've got the usual user and kernel modes running inside the host OS. And then I start up a guest VM, and I've got the same user and kernel mode. Now, something interesting that we'll come back to here is that for every guest partition we start up, we have a VMWP, a virtual machine worker process running inside the host. And that becomes an interesting, well, I'll touch on this. It's an interesting way a malicious admin could peer inside your VM. So inside both the host and guest OS, you've got authenticated user creds that are hashed sitting in memory. And in addition to that, we've got kernel code integrity running, trying to protect the binaries on the system. This is all great. And then lastly, you've got storage hanging off your guest VM. So not only do you have the VM's VHDX file, but we have various file artifacts that we store on disk in support of the VM. The configuration file, the replica files, et cetera. Snapshots, all that stuff. Well, today, all of that is inside the same trust boundary. Now, when we built previous versions of Hyper-V, this is great. This was fully the intended model. We have the assertion, in fact, you can find it in all our threat models, that the hypervisor fully trusts the host OS. The host OS kernel makes all kinds of privileged hypercalls and can do all kinds of things in the system. But what does this really mean from a security perspective? Well, in today's world, everything that I'm booting and running goes unmeasured. And in addition to not putting those code integrity checks and secure boot types of safeguards in place, admins can do whatever they want on the system, including enabling debuggers. And they can use that debugger to look at host OS state or hypervisor state or attach user mode debuggers to processes running, et cetera, et cetera. They can load up all kinds of tools, sysinternals tools or Mimicat tools or you name it. As I mentioned, the host OS kernel has full access to all kinds of critical system resources, processor MSRs, MMIO space is, they have unfettered access. The host OS in Server 2012 can make privileged hypercalls. Anyone know what hypercalls are? You familiar with that term? Yes? No? Hypercalls are just a moniker we have for the API surface for the hypervisor. So everything that the management partition can do when it wants to create a new partition or add a virtual processor, et cetera, there's an interface, a programming interface for all of that. We call those hypercalls. Some of them are privileged. Some of them today even say, hey, suspend all your memory protections or disable the hypervisor. And, for instance, for supporting sleep states on mobile devices, we have to drop the memory curtain, we call it, between the hypervisor and the host so that we can write things out to the hyper file or suspend them. Dangerous thing in, the wrong application. So the host OS today can do all kinds of things, and the hypervisor fully cooperates with all of this, and we just say, hey, if you can exploit the kernel, you own the box, so we don't guard against that today. We have this kernel code integrity running in the host OS. Great. Code integrity is a great thing. It works well, but it's admin configurable. As host admin, I can control what code integrity policies run on the machine. I can also, if I'm malware and I can get a foothold in the kernel. The first thing I'd like to go defeat is code integrity so that I can continue to run my own malicious code. These authenticated user credentials are sitting in memory, and they're fully available to the OS kernel. So again, with malicious tools or malware, you can go in and try to extract these hashes, and I'm sure you've heard much about the pass the hash attack. There are many sessions at Ignite this year talking about this. Those credentials are sitting there with, easy access to malicious actors in the platform. So also, when we started up this guest OS, same problem, right? We haven't measured those binaries. We don't have any strong guarantees about what we're running. Same thing with authenticated user creds and code integrity, right? Their user creds are in memory, code integrity sitting there. Malicious actors can go try to subvert those things. Now, the interesting other attack surface that I mentioned here is this virtual machine worker process. Again, we spin one of these up for every VM that it gets launched on the host. Well, it has full access inside the VM. And in fact, it's responsible for exposing virtual devices to the VM, for handling memory management stuff, handling interrupts, etc. So by design, it has full authority to look into the guest OS. Well, if you're malware in the kernel on the host, or if you're the admin on the box, you can attach a debugger to this thing, or use other tools, inject code, etc. So again, we have a pretty convenient conduit into whatever's running inside the guest VM. And lastly, everything sitting out on disk today, without the solutions that we're talking about, is unencrypted. So everything's sitting in clear text, and as Dean so ably demonstrated today, you can just mount up the VHD and take a look inside and walk off with your favorite healthcare provider's records. So how do we change all of this to build the type of solutions that we're offering in server virtualization and on client machines? What makes all of this tick? There's lots of components to virtualization-based security here. One of the most interesting that we'll touch on in a minute is virtual secure mode. This is actually something we offer as an enlightenment. In other words, the hypervisor advertises, hey, I've got this thing. If you know how to take advantage of it, whoever is running in the partition above me, tell me, enable that, and you can take advantage of this facility. So we offer virtual secure mode as a hypervisor facility that any partition can take advantage of, the host partition or an enlightened guest partition. Inside this virtual secure mode, we have a little tiny runtime environment that you can do stuff with. There's a user and a kernel mode component to that we refer to as isolated user mode and the smart secure kernel. We'll come back to that a little bit. Running on top of this execution environment are things we call trustlets. So trustlets are little pieces of code that have been refactored to take advantage of this environment so that they can protect the secrets that they manage. One of the trustlets that we can run is outsourcing code integrity to the hypervisor, and we'll come back and talk a little bit about this more as well. You can do this both for the host OS and for guest VMs. So now we're moving the trust boundary for code integrity to a stronger place. This virtual machine worker process that we create on a per partition basis is also hardened and bolstered in a number of ways. And we use that to protect all of the VM state and to facilitate creating these shield VMs. Another key component that gets a lot of recognition just by virtue of the name is the fact that we can offer a TPM now to a guest partition, a virtual TPM. And with that, you can take advantage of everything that a TPM brings, crypto services, measurement, extension, protecting of secrets, etc., inside a guest VM, notably here to encrypt the disk. We've got lots of restrictions, as Dean alluded to, on what a host can do once you build one of these guest VMs. So we've made a bunch of changes in Hyper-V to pull away easy portals of access or actions that would be used to leak guest secrets. And we've done a bunch of changes to strengthen the boundary between the hypervisor and the host OS, which we can touch on a little bit. But the key takeaway here is virtual secure mode. This hypervisor enlightenment that we offer up to partitions. This is sort of the linchpin of the whole virtualization-based security thing. So let's look at this a little quickly. Virtual secure mode is used, again, for all of these assurance plays. What is it? The easiest way to think about this, again, I put a good 30, 60 seconds into trying to outline this to make it clear, right? Virtual secure mode is a set of memory protections enforced by the hypervisor that creates a boundary between everything in the OS that we have and something you can think of as a secure world. In that, you can host a small runtime environment, which itself can support code that operates on platform secrets without revealing them. Again, this is the essence of what makes all of these security assurances work. So, how does VSM itself work? Well, we don't need to dive too deep into this stuff, but what's interesting is that we have this concept we implement called virtual trust levels. I tend to think of these as hypervisor synthetic privilege levels. Like you have user and kernel today, the hypervisor can sort of manifest these virtual trust levels. That's what gives us memory isolation that protects ranges of physical memory from everything else running in the platform, all the other code running in the platform. Again, a key point here that gives this robustness is that these protections are created and managed by the hypervisor, and they're literally enforced at the time of page translation in the hypervisor. So we have a couple of these VTLs today in VSM, and we think of these, if you're familiar with Trust Zone on other platforms, it's kind of the same concept, right? We have a normal world and a secure world, and we keep those things segregated through these memory protections. Now, our design accommodates an arbitrary number of virtual trust levels, but today we're only supporting these two. And these are hierarchical, and the higher the number, the stronger level of protection. And the higher VTLs are in control of access permissions for lower levels. And again, the key takeaway about all of this is that you can't change virtual trust levels from the normal OS, even in kernel mode, even with malware. The hypervisor enforces these the minute a partition touches a page and tries to access it. We get control and look at those permission masks and have the last right of refusal. So, what do you run inside of this virtual secure mode? Well, again, we've got this small secure kernel, this proxy kernel called SMART, this secure mode application runtime, and this isolated user mode construct. And really what that does is ensure that all of the calls in user mode between normal and secure world are segregated strongly. And on top of these, you refactor code into trustlets or Windows security applications that the code is structured in such a way that any secrets in the platform remain inside the secure world and can't be removed. So today, this is all Microsoft code. We don't extend this to third-party applications. So what trustlets do we have? Again, we have a refactored credential manager, the LSASS, Local Security Authority, has been split to run inside of this normal and secure world and kind of straddle that boundary such that all your authenticated user creds stay inside virtual secure mode. As I mentioned, we've also refactored kernel code integrity with that same kind of split. And this is also where we support the virtual device for providing this VTPM to guest virtual machines. And in addition, VSM has some of its own keys and does other protections as well. But these are the three major components that run inside of Server 2016. Now, I thought this picture was interesting, and I threatened to go through every box and pipe on here and every transition and kernel call and trap, and, no, we're not going to do that. What's useful about this illustration are these four key points. This box, or this drawing, really kind of helps emphasize what makes VSM strong. we have a super small secure kernel on the right-hand side. There's really not much in there. All it does is marshal traffic over to the normal world. And as you can see on the left-hand side of the NTOS, all the normal kernel calls for doing things are over there. So there's really very, very little running inside virtual secure mode. That's what you want for a minimal security attack surface. Then at the top here, we've got these light blue boxes where we have our user mode threads that represents these trustlets. One side's running in the secure world, one side's running in the normal world. So code's refactored to keep things secret in the secret place. And the key takeaway, too, is it's the hypervisor that's in control of this. The smallest, most robust, most protected piece of system software running on the platform is enforcing all of these transitions using hardware available to it. Pretty strong security boundaries with this. Okay. Hypervisor enforced code integrity. So again, today, all our code integrity is done in the kernel. Kernel gets compromised, gets malware running at it. That code integrity policy or the engine itself is a target to be overrun. With virtualization-based security, we're moving that into the secure world in one of these trustlets. Now, the hypervisor enforces all page access permissions for every page in the platform. So the way this is structured today in Server 2016 is code integrity runs inside virtual secure mode. So anytime someone starts an executable, those pages, all the calculations on them get done in this protected environment where they can't get manipulated. And when the code integrity engine has approved a page, it notifies the hypervisor, and the hypervisor will do the appropriate execution marking to let that run. So this gives us a pretty strong assurance that code integrity is far more robust now and protected against malware or malicious tools, etc. An interesting note here, too, is that we're also using hypervisor enforced code integrity to protect that little secure mode runtime environment. So those smart IUM binaries, those are all measured before they're loaded and verified by the hypervisor at load time, and we're using code integrity to protect those during the runtime of the OS existence. So much stronger stuff. So knowing that virtual secure mode has rich security targets sitting in it, you can imagine that somebody's going to quickly figure out that they want to go after this thing using DMA. So if you can get a bad device driver on the machine, or if you can manage to get some kernel code to run, hopefully not as easy today, you could mount a DMA attack against this secure memory region and try to draw contents out of it. So to protect against that, again, the hypervisor is going to use these DMA remapping units, or the IOMMU in the system. You'll recognize this as Intel's device virtualization technology. The hypervisor can control, through the IOMMU, all the memory ranges that a device is trying to access. So again, we do that low level in a robust way. We take control of this early, and we can prevent arbitrary DMA access around the system. So only approved ranges to a device are allowed through by the hypervisor. And normal mode devices that you have sitting there have memory protections commensurate with normal mode of the OS. So they can only see things that the normal world gets to see. You might be wondering if I could put a device directly into virtual secure mode, if I could assign a device directly. You can think of some interesting use cases, right? There's security devices. You might want to pipe their contents directly into this secured environment and keep them there. The architecture supports that, and it's something that we're looking at. The initial implementation that's not something that we're delivering. Okay, so protecting VM state. This is really the crux of it. Yes?
What you said with that, are you thinking about like running other security systems potentially in that secure kernel? Is that what you just mentioned is a potential use case for the future?
Are we considering running other things in the secured environment for other use cases? Yes. Strictly speaking, just to split hairs intentionally, they wouldn't run in the secure kernel. That kernel will never really be expanded beyond what it does by design. As an isolated user mode trustlet application, yes, the architecture was conceived to use many more trustlets and use cases than we have today. What those are, we'll wait to see how that shapes up, what runs there, but we're actively looking at lots of ways we can leverage this technology. Okay, so what's protecting VM state all about, really? We've made this declaration that your VM state's protected at rest, when the data is lying around on disk, and when it's in motion on the wire. To do this, we have to use a Generation 2 virtual machine. Gen 2 VMs, is everyone familiar with a Gen 2 VM? You know what that is? Right. So Gen 2 VMs see a virtual UEFI firmware implementation, again, through this virtual machine worker process in the host. That lets us leverage secure boot in the VM, and this UEFI implementation supports a 2.0 TPM. That means that Server 2012 and 2012 R2 guests are fully supported as shielded VMs, of course, with Server 2016 guests as well. Now, as Dean mentioned, there's limitations with down-level OSs and their ability to run in a Gen 2 VM. To make, one of the things we did with Gen 2 was strip it way down, remove all the emulated devices. It's fully modernized. It's all synthetic devices. It's much leaner and more isolated against noisy neighbor kinds of attacks. There's many, many reasons that Gen 2 is desirable, and that's where all our future innovation is going to be targeted. The legacy operating systems have a problem with that because we stripped out some of the devices and things that they require to run. So we're putting our heads together trying to figure out how we can offer these kinds of protections or some subset of these protections on down-level guests. And there's a number of ways we might go about approaching that. So stay tuned, and we'll see if we can get protections in a Gen 1 VM. Yes. Yeah, Dean mentioned that earlier, that that is actively under investigation, and our goal and intent is to offer these types of securities for Linux as well as Windows guest VMs. One thing to point out that if you want to use virtual secure mode inside a guest, which you might recall from some of the earlier diagrams, so that you can protect the guest's credentials and code integrity and do secure and measured boot with a guest, that requires Server 2016. That is not something we can backport because, again, remember, virtual secure mode is a capability we offer up from the hypervisor. So any OS that wants to take advantage of those capabilities has to be enlightened. It has to know what that interface is and how to use it, so it has to be hard-coded in. So that's not the kind of thing we can backport. Okay, so more about protecting VTPM state. So for protecting data at rest, the way we enable that is by giving you this virtual TPM inside the guest partition. Again, we're virtualizing the 2.0 device, right? It provides stronger cipher strength. It is the most current modern device moving forward. It was not tractable to virtualize both a 1.2 and a 2.0 device. That just doesn't make sense. The code turns out too diverse to do that. So we've settled all the way around for these enterprise assurance scenarios on a 2.0 version in the host if you want to take advantage of those full protections, and we're using a 2.0 version in our synthetic device. And that's a key point too. This is a synthetic virtual device. There's no correlation between the VTPM in a guest and the physical TPM that might be on the host. And we do that for good reason, right? You want to be able to live migrate your VMs. So if you're storing secrets for your VM or protecting a key in the physical TPM, how do you move it to another host? So the concept of the host TPM for its protections and this virtual TPM are separate from that regard. And having a TPM there allows you to light up all the things that a TPM does. Again, crypto services, secure boot, and most notably, encryption of your VHDX data. And so for Windows, that means BitLocker. In transparent mode. You don't have to sit and type in a key. Everything is sealed to the virtual TPM. It's this hardened virtual machine worker process. Remember, VMWP hosts virtual devices for guest VMs. So there's code running in the host providing every device to every guest on the system. This hardened worker process now is going to host this virtual TPM device. We need to protect that thing. It has access to guest secrets. And this hardened worker process will handle all other encryption on the shielded VM's behalf. So not only do we encrypt this VTPM state, which I just mentioned, but all live migration egress traffic, everything on the wire is encrypted automatically. You don't have to stand up IPsec or anything else. If you turn on a shielded VM and deploy one, you get encryption protection of everything. We also protect all the other disk artifacts, the VMCX file, the new configuration file format, and the runtime state file that we have now. All of that stuff is just encrypted by default. So there's a little bit of overhead to this, right? And we're trying to get our heads around really what the impact is today. We don't expect it to be much, and we are trying to optimize, of course, but before you send all the live migration memory contents across the wire, if we have to encrypt it all first and then decrypt on the other end, there's going to be some parasitic drag on your live migration performance. So again, something we're keenly interested in minimizing, and we're kind of working on all that now, getting our heads around what the numbers look like and where we can optimize. So hardening the worker process, what does that mean? How do we do that? Again, one for each virtual machine, and all your VDEVs are in there. And it also handles all kinds of important stuff like lifecycle management. So starting, stopping, creating, snapshotting, all that stuff flows through the worker process. And again, if you can attach a debugger to that or somehow get malicious code running in it, you can peer into anybody's guest VM. So to harden that, we're now running the worker process as a protected process light. You might remember protected processes got introduced way back when for DRM scenarios, and they've evolved over time. There's now a thing called a PPL, a protected process light. Regardless of the details, what it really means is you can't attach a user mode debugger to this process. It won't allow it. Its state in paging and crash dump files is encrypted. And we do a strong code integrity check on anything that runs as a protected process. We do all the hash checks, and all those things have to be signed. And so we've also gone in and done a bunch of other retooling inside the worker process to restrict handle access and minimize code injection and opportunities and other stuff. So another thing Dean mentioned that's interesting, that things that you can do with a VM once it's shielded go away. Console mode access, as you saw. The thumbnail image for the display on a shielded VM is blanked out. Insecure WMI calls are disabled. KVPs, key value pairs, are an interesting way to exchange information between a host and a guest. You can do some handy things with them. In fact, that capability gets abused a lot. All of the insecure KVP channels in between the host and guest are denied on a shielded VM.
Isn't used by the VM protection for Hyper-V, for Active Directory right now with the VM gen ID?
The VM generation ID?
The generation ID?
Luckily enough, I know the answer to that. No, not remotely.
Good. I thought that was
No, they're not related, so few.
And this last item, moving quickly here, this last item, initial machine config registry hive injection. That's an approach to minimizing the number of reboots you need when you sysprep an image and boot it up for the first time. It lets you stuff a whole pre-canned registry hive into the guest VM. Big attack surface, not allowed on a restricted VM. And again, we've stripped out all the insecure virtual devices to minimize attack surface. So now, all of this tax and overhead can be a little onerous. So we're actively looking at custom security configurations that let you dial back the level of protection a little bit. A couple of ways you might want to use these, right? There might be some scenarios where you do trust your host admins. You still want to protect data at rest, but you trust the host admins, and you don't need a robust level of protection from them. Or you have hardware that doesn't have the minimal requirements for all of this, and you still want to turn some of this on. So we have basically 3 modes. Basic TPM, right? You can insert a virtual TPM into a guest machine and do TPM things with it like BitLocker or Secure Boot. Taking it up a notch, you can have this worker process do all the other encryption for you. So live migration traffic and all the other file artifacts get encrypted by default. You don't have to do anything else. That allows you to do full data at rest with a TPM in the device, but your admin can still do all the other stuff. But it means basic console mode access still works. That might be important to a lot of you, I'm guessing. So, and then the last thing is the fully shielded offering, which we've talked about here, the full set of protections. And we're doing a lot of work to change all these hypervisor trust boundaries between the hypervisor and the host OS. So locking down critical processor MSRs, restricting MMIO address space access, removing these privileged hypercalls that let you turn off the hypervisor, other things, all have changed now. And we've also taken a look at all the system power state transition, sleep, hibernate, system reset. We're again, going through a deep security threat analysis now and looking at all ways that those can be used to mount an attack and taking steps to harden things across the industry to make some of this work better. So, and lastly, it's a given that if you're running these trustlets, virtual secure mode is going to have secrets in it. And because the hypervisor is in control of all of this stuff, at any given time, the hypervisor might have something in it that's a secret, and we would have no way of knowing it in the hypervisor code. So we have also encrypted all crash dumps, the system hibernation file for client scenarios. All of those things now are encrypted. Interesting to note, too, that by default in Hyper-V now, we don't include any of the guest pages in a crash dump. You have to go explicitly turn that on. I don't know why we didn't do that before. So now when the system crashes, all you get is host OS and hypervisor, whatever level you've turned on. But for the most part, no guest pages should show up in that crash dump file. And what's interesting to note here, remember at the top of this presentation, if you're an admin, you can hang a debugger on the box and do all kinds of things. Well, that's something that we measure now as part of this measured boot. And as Dean described, when we send off those attestation logs to the host guardian service, that's part of something that you can include in policy and say, no, I'll never give you the key to start a shielded VM on that host if you've got debuggers enabled. All right, so what does this look like now? Referring back to our picture, how have we changed the trust boundaries? Let's go through this quickly. So same thing, you've got your hardware, hypervisor, host OS, but now these red boxes here denote a much stronger trust boundary. So now when we boot up, we've got virtual secure mode here inside our host OS, straddling this user kernel boundary. Weak signal. There we go. This whole thing, everything we booted, the critical system binaries, firmware, OS loader, OS kernel, hypervisor, even the binaries in the secure runtime itself, all of this can be measured, extended to a PCR in the TPM, which the TPM will sign, seal, and deliver to the host guardian service, and it can attest to, yep, I like what you're running there. It meets my policy. Great. Now we can, we've also hardened up this kernel hypervisor boundary, right? So the host OS can't attack the hypervisor by defeating virtualization mode or other avenues. And on our host, we're protecting the user credentials. They all stay inside virtual secure mode, the hashes. And you can see LSA running outside there. And we've got the hypervisor in charge of code integrity now. So we do all those hash and signature verifications, cert checks inside virtual secure mode. It calls down to the hypervisor. When it says yes, the hypervisor flips the execute bit on those pages. So much more robust protection here of just the host. Now we come along and start up a guest VM. If it's a server 2016 guest, you can also enable virtual secure mode inside that guest. You get the same protections. Admin credentials are shielded, and kernel code integrity is again managed by the hypervisor. The worker process instance for every shielded VM is a protected process. I can't attach a debugger to it. I can't peer inside of it. I can't inject a thread in it, etc. It's hosting a virtual TPM VDEV, making it available to any partition. So I can add a virtual TPM to my guest OS. Now I can use that to do secure boot, to do other encryption things with a TPM, notably encrypt my VHDX. And again, the hardened worker process will take care of encrypting everything else for me. So that is part and parcel of virtualization-based security. Every component that we need to realize these solutions, why we've refactored things in the way that we do, what's required in the hardware, and why you need it, and what you get from it. And with that, let's wrap it up.
Thank you, Alan. All right, so there's a couple of technical takeaways here. Then let's just summarize these then. So we know that the data and state of a shielded VM can't be inspected, can't really be stolen. It's all encrypted, either at rest, in flight, on the wire. All of that is encrypted. We know that TPM-backed disk encryption is supported now in the guest OS, and it still manages to root itself in hardware because it's rooted in VSM, which is rooted in hardware. So we still get that same level of trust that we get from a physical TPM. Security protection is rooted in hardware. Shielded VMs run on known good hosts. The code integrity policy and the attestation service ensure that. So you can't go and change the host code so that it does things you want it to do as a malicious admin or as just a malicious attacker. It runs what we want it to run. It obeys our instruction set. So preview customer scenarios in use today. Organizations that have to adhere to strong compliance or regulatory concerns are evaluating this now because suddenly those concerns, the checkboxes, can be ticked. This wasn't possible in the past. Virtualization of sensitive workloads that were previously restricted, such as domain controllers, this is now reasonable because you haven't flipped the trust on its head. You haven't said Hyper-V is now more powerful than a domain admin. It still remains the same relationship. It's just running with inside it. Worst case scenario, they switch it off. Well, AD can tolerate that. We have lots of domain controllers. Enterprise is now able to place those sensitive workloads in branch offices. Imagine you wanted to run a domain controller in a branch office where the secrets of everyone back in the head office in New York were not really great to be present there. That's not a good idea. Or it could be even a foreign nation where it's running. You could now shield that VM and have a domain controller run there, no longer an RODC, and all the compatibility woes that come along with that. You can have a full domain controller there and still consider it protected. Stronger protections, arguably, than even an RODC provides. And Guido may differ with that because he loves RODCs. So a quick request to all of you in the audience. We have a security survey. Would you mind raising your hand if you're prepared to fill it out? I would guess it would take you about 2 minutes. So if you could all raise your hands, we would appreciate it. The data on this is very easy for you to answer, and you can put don't know if you don't want to. But we would appreciate you filling it out. It's going to be very handy for us. Thank you so much. Last but not least, some related sessions. We did this session yesterday with Anders. This was the platform strategy session around security. I would wholeheartedly recommend you download that. Anders has a very, very clever way of looking at the world. Anders is the technical fellow on the Windows Server Systems Center side of the house. He has a very, very unique and serialized view of things, and he builds a great story. So wholeheartedly recommend that. Enabling data protection in Microsoft Azure, that's the Azure equivalent to VM shielding. As I said, a slightly lesser set of assurances by virtue of them being on Gen 1 right now. And we're looking to see how we line things up there. When they get to Gen 2, the assurances start to line up too. Last but not least, dropping the hammer down on malware threats with Windows 10's Device Guard. Who the hell came up with that title?
Scott.
Says the guy in the front row who owns this technology.
Yeah.
So, yes, that's an interesting one. I shall go to you for my title next time. Also, another great session. The two are not related, so don't get this guard thing and start overlapping them. In fact, we met recently just to make sure our UX teams figured out this wasn't the same product. So they are different, but they do provide very similar things. But there's a lot of common components.
And they do use virtualization-based security for at least part of it. So that credential protection, outsourced code integrity, the virtual secure mode, all of that is applicable to some of the device guard scenarios. So it's good stuff. Go see Scott's talk.
Yeah, indeed. So that is it. Thank you for taking the time. I hope you found the demo useful and all of Alan's insider architectural information. There's a lot of technical info there, so please feel free to review the deck afterwards. Alan and I will hang out for a few minutes, so if you've got questions, please feel free to come up and pose them. Thanks, everyone.